that is pretty much all the housekeeping I have. There is no need to give you all the please mute yourselves and that kind of speech. Um, but I do want to give a little plug for racial justice here at Transfiguration. So, as some background, in the wake of George Floyd's death, our parish, like many churches, most churches, I would hope, or all, struggled with wanting to do something to have some sort of tangible reaction that we could stand with our brothers and sisters of color. And so it just so happened that we also have a group of parishioners here at the FIG who had gone on a civil rights pilgrimage just 1 year earlier. And they were continuing to meet for fellowship and conversation and had plans to do things like visit the Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thankfully, that group invited the rest of the congregation to join in the discussion. And so before you know it, we were meeting monthly and we started an anti-racism reading group. And so we've, had some things to do, but it's been a pandemic. So our work might have been a little limited by that, but we have this leadership group now that meets monthly, and for the next program year, they're hoping to focus on two main areas: education and building relationships. And they'll be considering things like what repentance and reparations might look like, and the impact of incarceration on our communities. And as you all know, we have loads of work to do. And here at Transfiguration, we're absolutely committed to the concept of being beloved community, and we hope that you all are too. And if anyone in the webinar this evening is not joining us in those meetings, you are welcome to. In fact, you are encouraged to. We hope you will. Just let me know. I will put our contact information in the chat, and y'all will surely be able to find me on the website too. So email or call anytime, and I will get you more details. All right, y'all. So here I'm going to say an opening prayer, and then I'm going to pass it over to Barbara, and then I'm going to mute myself. So let us pray. God of love, we thank you for this opportunity to gather in your name. And we thank you for Zoom, the tool that has helped us continue to invite amazing speakers and preachers and teachers who, with your help, form us and mold us, that we might glorify you even during a pandemic. Lord, we're so grateful to have Dawn and Jocelyn join us this evening, and we ask you to bless them in their work. We ask you also to send your Holy Spirit to join us this evening, to open our ears, and more importantly, our hearts, that we might be moved to action, to truly love our neighbors as ourselves, working tirelessly for justice, offering mercy at every opportunity, and seeking and serving Christ in all persons. In your Son's holy and precious name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, y'all. Well, I will mute myself now and turn it over to Barbara.
So Dawn and Jocelyn Pinkard are co-owners of Hidden History DFW. Hidden History DFW is a company that provides African-American tours, educational presentations, and apparel celebrating African-American history. Both are native Texans and were raised in Dallas. What once started as a simple means to honor family history, Hidden History DFW uncovers the forgotten sites of Dallas that were instrumental in developing one of the largest and most vibrant African-American communities in the country. Hidden History DFW has been in operation for 4 years and has conducted tours for over 1,500 people in the Dallas area. Hidden History DFW provides tours for schools, family reunions, civic groups, historical societies, churches, corporations, and nonprofit organizations, and others interested in the rich background of African-American history in the Dallas area. In addition to conducting tours, Hidden History DFW also produces African-American themed documentary films. The Great Yates is a film which was selected as a finalist in the documentary category in the 2020 National Black Film Festival and featured at the 2020 USA Film Festival. Besides tours and documentaries, Hidden History DFW has an online store providing apparel, celebrating and honoring African-American history. Dawn and Jocelyn retired from careers in corporate life and education respectfully. They have been married for 40 years and have 2 adult children and 4 grandchildren. So welcome, Don and Jocelyn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dana, Barbara, and to the church at large for inviting us to share this time with you tonight. We'll try to be respectful of your time as well. Maybe if we can go into screen sharing mode, we can get started. Okay, so I was asking questions before we got started to try to get a feel for the audience since we can't see you guys. And I was told that there are adults as well as some youth. And also we have a varied background in terms of people who were raised in Texas and have spent the majority of their lives here, as well as people who have come here for other opportunities and other reasons. So to kind of level set, we will start with giving a brief history of Texas to kind of set the stage before we start talking about the African American experience in Dallas. So most of you are familiar, and I know most of the youth, the teenagers, have taken Texas history, and you're familiar with this date, and we're not going to quiz you on dates at the end, but you know that the Republic of Texas was actually formed in 1836. And you're kind of familiar with these, fathers of our state. William Travis, Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, and most of you, I am sure, whether you're a native Texan or not, you know the story of the Alamo. Most of you, I think, are probably going to be familiar with the Battle of San Jacinto. For those of you who may not be, you guys may have remember the film. The Texans did not win at the Alamo. Many people thought it was a victory for the Texans, but it was not. Texans actually won at the Battle of San Jacinto, which was a few weeks later, April 21st, 1836. And that is considered the birth of what we consider Texas. That happened in 1836, and then 9 years later, in 1845, Texas actually joins the Union, and it becomes a 28th state. Those of you who are students of history, you know that it was a big controversy about whether a state was to be admitted as a slave state or a free state. And there was a lot of people that wanted to make sure that that balance remained as it was. So typically what they did in this period of American history is they admitted a slave state at the same time as they admitted a free state to keep the balance between slave states and free states pretty much equal. We're not going to ask you to remember dates and numbers, but we will ask you just to try to remember one stat. And that's the stat that we have right here. And we highlight this on our in-person tour, so we're going to share it with you. In 1836, and remember that is when we consider the origin of the state, there were 5,000 enslaved people in Texas. In 1860, and this is 1 year before the Civil War, that number had increased to over 200,000. So we had a 40-fold increase in the number of enslaved people in a very short period of time, actually 24 years. We went from 5,000 enslaved people to over 200,000. I can't see your faces or your hands, and I would ask you this question, but I'm assuming that most people on this call have probably seen this cabin. This is it's actually a reproduction of the John Neely Bryant cabin. It sits right in the heart of downtown Dallas. And it sits there to commemorate John Neely Bryant, who's considered the founder of Dallas. So just, kind of keeping the perspective in mind, Texas becomes a state in 1836. Dallas doesn't exist, okay? It takes 5 years for this gentleman here to actually come and found Dallas, what we now know as Dallas, on the banks of the Trinity River. So who were these early people that came here if Dallas was not part of the state when Texas became a state. So this is a pie chart that shows the distribution of the early white settlers of Dallas. And this is around 1850. And you see the largest percentage of them came from what we term the Upper South. That's North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia. We also had a significant amount of the early settlers of Dallas that were from other slave states. And these were slave states that did not rebel and join the Confederacy. They were, in many cases, what we classify as border states. 29% were in that category. And then we had a large percent that were from free states, you know, states that we typically consider as northern states like Connecticut, Illinois, and so forth. A lot of people mistakenly believe that, you know, most of these early Dallas settlers came from Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. There was a number of them that came from that place, but in a lot of cases, those places were just stops on the way with an ultimate destination to be Texas. And those of you who have explored the state, you know that there were a considerable number of people that were even from other countries. And we still have communities of, you know, that were established as German communities, Czech communities around the state. What did they do? So 60% of the people who came and established this city, they were farmers. And 23% were small business owners, professionals, craftsmen. A large percentage were laborers. 47% of them were classified as poor. And only 8%, even though people think of Dallas as a rich city from its foundation, only 8% of those early inhabitants would be people that we would classify as wealthy. And this next slide kind of aligns with the earlier slide. So, you know, in 1840, we didn't have any enslaved people in Dallas, and that was because there was no Dallas. By 1850, we had 207 people that were classified as enslaved. And then a mere 10 years later, once again, a year before the Civil War began, we had over 1,000 enslaved people living in what we know as Dallas. Now, we don't know a lot about these early enslaved people, but there are some things that we are sure of. One, none of them were free. They were all enslaved. Now, that's not to say that there were not free African Americans in other parts of the state, but as far as Dallas is concerned, none of the African Americans in what we know as Dallas were free. Most of them worked in agriculture. Some of them learned trades like carpentry or how to be a blacksmith and so forth. And actually, some of them were hired out to other people to do domestic work and those type of occupations. Now, there's not a lot written in the newspapers about these early African American settlers, but I'll just share, you know, a couple of highlights from, you know, research on newspapers. Obviously, you know, it was a difficult time for African Americans, and the first known report in a newspaper of an African American person was a lady named Jane Elkins. And Jane Elkins she's famous for a lot of reasons. She was actually the first person to ever be executed in Dallas. And she was actually executed right, you see that picture of the old red courthouse, famous building downtown? Well, the building actually came into existence in 1992, but it was always the site of the courthouse. And she was actually hanged in 1853. She was executed for killing a gentleman in what we now know as Carrollton. And she was hired out. She was a domestic worker for a gentleman named Mr. Wisdom. In 1860, and we talk about this on an in-person tour, one of the greatest tragedies in the history of Dallas occurred in 1860. And at that time, Dallas was really only a square mile. Some of you may be old enough to remember, you know, TV shows like Marshall Dillon and Gunsmoke and those types of things. Well, that is kind of the way that Dallas looked in 1860. The entire city that we now know as a 400 square mile metropolis was really only 1 square mile. And in 1860, 1 year before the Civil War, it was actually burned to the ground. And there were 3 men that were later found not to have anything to do with that fire. They were African Americans. They were rounded up after a crowd had formed, and they were hanged at Martyrs Park. The photograph at the bottom of the slide is actually Martyrs Park today. We actually, cover it as one of the sites on our tour, in-person tour of Dallas. Actually, every person in Dallas at that time, whites, blacks, old, young, children, they actually attended the hanging of these 3 men. It was a very, very big public spectacle at the time. So moving forward, as you guys know, we're not going to talk about the Civil War, but the Civil War played a large part in what happened in terms of African American history in Dallas. So following emancipation, African Americans had a very difficult decision. And I think if we examine that decision using the sensibilities that we have today, we would think it would be a simple decision. But actually at the time, it was a very difficult decision. And that decision was, we are now free. What do we do? Do we continue to work on plantations and in the homes of others? Or do we strike out and see what we can make of our own lives? And these are some actual quotes from people at that time. And I'm not going to read all 3 of them. I'll just pick the one in the middle. This is an actual quote from an enslaved person. And he says, when we were freed, you could tie all that we had in a bed sheet. So it wasn't like they were walking away with a 401k or retirement or severance pay or anything like that. If you chose to leave and strike out on your own, you were facing a difficult time ahead. But there were some people that were very courageous, even at the time of that decision. And I'll read one of the quotes. Let me pick the middle one. And this gentleman, I don't know who he was, but I like his quote. He says, "We thought we were going to be richer than the white folks because we were stronger and knew how to work. And the whites didn't. And we didn't have to work for them anymore." So here's a guy, he's very courageous, very adventuresome, and he's very optimistic in terms of how he sees his future. So to kind of review where Black people were located at this time, Dallas is kind of located at the left border of this map. The dark parts of the map show where African Americans were greatly concentrated at that time. And so the large footprint for African American citizens at that time was located in the eastern part of the state, in the Houston area. Many of you guys are familiar with towns like Conroe, Beaumont, Jasper, those kind of towns. And then in the northeastern part of the state, if you're a native Texan, you're probably familiar with areas like Longview, Marshall, Tyler. That's where the great concentration of African Americans were at this time. Dallas, relatively speaking, had a small African American community. Now, there are several African American communities in the Dallas area, or there were at this time. I think your church is located in the northern part of the city. There were an African American community headed by a gentleman. His name was Anderson Bonner. If any of you are familiar with that name, he actually, even though he was an African American, he was very prosperous, and he owned quite a bit of land. He had been affiliated with the Caruth family, and he actually became quite an entrepreneur. But by and large, the largest concentration of African Americans were concentrated in what we call the State Thomas area. It's now referred to as Uptown. That's a term that even though many of the sites that we go to are located in current day Uptown, it's not it's not a term that we use, and we don't do that to be rebellious or anything, but we like to highlight the community as the African American establishment knew it at that time. And so the heart of the African American community in Dallas, all the way up until the 1950s, was an area called State Thomas, which was often referred to as the Harlem of the South. So following emancipation, maybe the most traumatic period of American history, that 5-year period, you know, some people would argue the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and people would argue other time periods. But I think the most important time, at least in light of African American history, is probably that 5-year time period between 1865 and 1870. And I say that because I think it defined the nation as we know it today. And the reason for that is that in 1865, you know, the 13th Amendment was ratified. A lot of people mistakenly say that Abraham Lincoln's signing of the the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 actually freed African Americans. One of the trick questions that we use in our presentations is, you know, how many African Americans were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? And the answer is 0. And I know that may be contrary to what many of us have learned in our history books, but Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't free any African Americans in the Deep South, because you must remember at that time, these states had already seceded from the Union. So they were not in any way going to listen to any declaration or proclamation from Abraham Lincoln. So the 13th Amendment was passed that actually freed African Americans across the country. The 14th Amendment that granted citizenship followed in 1868. And so as a result of the 14th Amendment, African Americans could do things like have official marriages, sue people in court, all the things that a normal citizen could do. So that was a very, very important amendment. And maybe the most important amendment of all occurred in 1869, and that was the 15th Amendment that gave African Americans finally the right to vote. So contrary to what many people believe, you know, it was not magic that Abraham Lincoln signed an Emancipation Proclamation, slaves are free, they start to vote immediately. That's not quite the way that things happen. It was a very difficult process between 1865 and 1870. So in 1871, the first time that African Americans in this state could vote, they did something exceptional, even by today's standards. So you see, I'll just focus on the bottom part of the slide. This is the 12th legislature for the state of Texas. And you see there are, I think, 14 representatives, 2 senators, and I think 12 state reps that were elected. Now, if you refer back to that map that I showed you, the one that had the dark coloring, most of these people that you see here, they were elected from, you know, Harris County, that we know today is, you know, the greater Houston area, Harrison County in East Texas, Limestone County in Central Texas, those of you who are familiar with the geography of the state. So there were 14 of these people elected, the first time that African Americans could ever vote in the state. Now, in 1871, 100 years later, 1971, 100 years later, you see that there are 3 people that are voted in the Texas state legislature. One of them is the name I think a lot of you are going to be familiar with, Barbara Jordan. She served in the Texas Senate. And then there were 2 people. A lot of you may be familiar with Zan Holmes. He's still very active in Dallas. He was elected to the state house. And the reason that we highlight this is that from 1895 and all the way until 1965, for a period of, you know, 70 years or so, there were no elected African-American officials in this state, right? So you had 14 in 1871, and that continued all the way up to 1890, 1893 or so. And then in 1895, basically, because of something called redemption, and we can answer questions on that if you have them, but that was a process that basically that Confederate states went through to essentially purge African-American participation on the political level. And it occurred not only in Texas, but it occurred in all of the southern states. Basically, there were laws, Jim Crow laws that were instituted. We had things like the poll tax and et cetera, that basically suppressed the African-American vote in the state, that led to no African-Americans serving in the Texas state legislature for 70 years. So after the Civil War, most of you are familiar with something called the Freedmen's Bureau. That was an agency set up to try to establish at least somewhat of a level playing field. It never got close to it, but they had certain obligations, and they helped the freed African Americans, as well as they helped the poor whites who populated the state through things like instituting supervised labor contracts that later evolved into sharecropping. They helped the indigenous people who were poor. They established the first schools in the state for African Americans to attend. And they also, as best they could, defended African Americans from violent acts. You know, and I won't go through these. I'll just let you look at them for a second, because I want to give you guys time for questions afterwards, and my wife is going to kind of wrap up the presentation. But this just gives you an idea of some of the crimes that were being committed at the time and that were adjudicated by the Freedmen's Bureau. Yeah, so you see a guy, a $200 fine for whipping a young African-American boy. And also, you guys have seen in the news lately a lot of publicity about the Tulsa incident from 1921. But there was an early incident in a place called Titus County, where all the African Americans had to flee. And believe it or not, when they fled to Dallas. But it was still a period of accomplishments, and my wife's going to tell you about a lot of them.
So as we go on, we're going to now get into more of what was going on in Dallas during this time. So we're going to begin with the establishment of education. So after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, African Americans saw education as an important step towards achieving equity, independence, and prosperity. Schools and colleges were established for African Americans and poor whites, which my husband mentioned earlier. Here in Texas, we have Paul Quinn College, which was founded in 1872. We have Wiley College in 1873, and Prairie View A&M University, which was established in 1876. Now, all these schools were established before the University of Texas in Austin, which was founded in 1883. Well, one form of resistance, there was the African Americans met a lot of resistance. And one form of this was through Black codes. Texas, like most Southern states, established Black codes. And Black codes were restrictive laws. They were designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and to ensure their availability as cheap labor force after slavery was abolished. And many Southern states had Black codes, which required Black people to sign yearly labor contracts. And if they refused, they were risk being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. And by 1890, the state of Texas was completely redeemed. My husband mentioned that earlier. But this meant that whites eliminated all Black political state office holders through voter intimidation and other means, and they regained full control. Other form of resistance includes Jim Crow, which is the segregation of races. And so you can see here, one form of Jim Crow was poll tax. You had to pay poll tax, and of course, if you were poor, you had no poll tax. And another one was the penalty of intermarriage. If you were intermarry, you were actually sent to prison. This image here is a prominent dentist. It is taken from the Texas Dallas Archive History of the Dallas Public Library. And Dallas had one of the largest Klan chapter in America with about 13,000 members. This photo here is of a man named Alan Brooks, and we have two photos so you can see it. In 1910, Alan Brooks was hanged in downtown Dallas. Mr. Brooks was accused of attempted rape of a 2-year-old. Although Mr. Brooks was arrested and in jail, a mob gathered outside Dallas County Courthouse, forced their way in, and beat and stabbed him and threw him out of the second-story window. In addition to that, they dragged his dead body to the Elks Arch, which it no longer exists anymore, but it existed for a long time. And it was actually at the intersection of Main and Eckerd. The image you see here, particularly this image here, is the large image they made into a postcard. So even with Jim Crow laws and the advancement of the KKK, and because of it, many rural African Americans in the South became part of the Great Migration. And you may be familiar with the Great Migration because this was when 6 million African Americans moved from the South, and they formed large Black populations in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles. But closer to home, here in the state of Texas, when you look at migrations, Blacks here and from Texas and Louisiana, they migrated to closer urban areas like Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. And African Americans migrating to these urban areas, they came from places like Longview, Marshall, Meharry, Beaumont, Lake Charles, and the like. The chart here shows the other great migration from rural areas in Texas and Louisiana to Dallas. So if you look at 1870, there was less than 5,000, but by 1920, there was just under 25,000 African Americans which had migrated here into the city of Dallas. One of the places Blacks in Dallas migrated to was the St. Thomas area. My husband mentioned this before. St. Thomas was considered the Harlem of the South. The reason behind the migration was simple. This area was first used to bury the dead. When you see freed African Americans, you see what happened was freed African Americans came into the area. When they did, Dallas was only 1 square mile. Remember, my husband said it was kind of like the Gunsmoke thing. And this area was considered the outskirts of Dallas where they buried the dead. So the Freeman Cemetery, if you know where it sits on the corner of Central Expressway and Hall and Lemon Avenue. And if you consider that, that was considered the outskirts of Dallas. But in that area, that's where they buried the Jewish, whites, and African American. So one of the first purchases of African American was this cemetery that we call the Freeman Cemetery. And there was about 2,000 to about 2,500 African Americans buried in the cemetery, which was operational until 1925. And the cemetery is now called Freeman Cemetery. And again, it's located off of Central Expressway in Hall and Lemon. But as the city of Dallas grew, transforming from rural to auto transportation, this cemetery was paved over with the building of the Central Expressway in the 1940. But the city continued to grow. You know, Dallas is a large city and continued to grow. And as it did, Central Expressway began to expand in that progress. So graves were discovered the second time of the expansion. And one brave woman, Dr. Mamie McKnight, got the expansion to stop until the remains of those buried would be recovered and placed in other cemeteries. And this delayed the freeway expansion for about 2.5 years. Now, in addition to the freemen purchase of the cemetery to bury their dead, a group of men led by Reverend Griggs purchased land to celebrate Juneteenth. That holiday is fast approaching us. The land became a park and was a gathering place for families and for them to have a place to play baseball. Ernie Banks, if you are a baseball fan, you may be familiar with Mr. Ernie Banks. He was a Hall of Famer and he played many games at this park, at this Griggs Park. The city of Dallas later purchased the park from Reverend Griggs, and the park became known as Hall Street Negro Park, and then it became Dallas's Negro Park #1. Now, today the park is called Griggs Park, and you know where it's located? In the State Thomas area of Uptown. Now, one of the oldest and original resident of the State Thomas neighborhood is this young lady here, Miss Ruth Sanders. I don't know if you've read about her. She's been, several articles have been written about her. Miss Sanders, she stays in a home that was built in 1929. She's still the owner of the home. And she may be the only remaining resident of the community of State Thomas, of the State Thomas neighborhood. She's 98 years old now. And Miss Sanders attended Booker T. Washington. She also attended Houston Tillotson, and she graduated for SMU. But the photograph down at the bottom, this is Mrs. Ruth Sanders' home that she actually still lives in, alongside the homes, the townhouses and the condominiums and the apartments that are in Uptown right now. At the same time as Blacks were migrating to the State Thomas area in North Dallas, others were migrating into Oak Cliff, which had a freedman's town. Now, many people don't realize Oak Cliff was its own city, just like Dallas is a city. Oak Cliff itself was an old city. It was annexed by Dallas later. But at this time, they had their own freedman's town as well. This area known today is called 10th Street Historical District. And another name for it, another area of it is called the Bottom. In this neighborhood, you have churches like Greater Bethel, and this residential house is called the Moore House. And on our tour, we're actually going to this neighborhood and we actually show this house. We get to see it. We get to explain a little bit more about the Moore House and why it's so significant, because there are streets and parks in this area that are named after the Moore family. Blacks in Dallas socialized on their one day at the State Fair of Texas. We found out today that the State Fair is going to be open for this year, and if you're like me, you're excited about it. But back in the day, African Americans only had one day to go to the State Fair of Texas. It was called Negro Day, and it was later called Negro Achievement Day. And here you see a photo of this gentleman. He's Duke Ellington, and he's at the State Fair of Texas with this little girl, and they're posing for a picture on Negro Day. Education played a pivotal role in the Black community, as we mentioned before, and St. Peter's, a private Catholic school, opened in 1910. Now, this is another one of our stops. We stop at St. Peter. We talk about how St. Peter's got there into the community, the Catholic Church got there, how the school got there. So it's one of the things that we talk about. St. Peter's still hosts services here today. And the school, which now houses Notre Dame School of Dallas, is a school for special need. But this church and the School of St. Peter's still is in Dallas today. And it's also in Uptown, which is the State Thomas area. This building here is called the Pythias Building, and it was designed by architect William Pittman, who was the son-in-law of Booker T. Washington, and it was opened in 1916. This building is still standing in DDD Bellum today. We got a chance, my husband and I got a chance to go to the renovated building and have lunch, have a brunch there recently, I think in the last month. So it's a really nice building. The building name comes from the Knights of Pythias, a fraternal organization. The photo here shows the Knights of Pythias at a convention in the 1920s. As I said before, the city of Dallas provided millions of dollars in renovation and actually joined in with the renovation with the private person who actually did the renovation. And in it's a hotel, and it has restaurants and other, the ballroom and everything that's there. So these are the tenants of the Pythias building back in the day. The Knights of Pythias was the first major commercial structure in Dallas, built for African Americans, by African Americans, with African American money. Now on the first floor, there was a barbershop and a drugstore. On the second floor, it held offices for doctors, lawyers, and other professionals. And on the fourth floor, there was a ballroom. That ballroom still looks wonderful today. It really does look wonderful. It's still beautiful as it was back then. So they had a ballroom back then and still now, and it hosted performing arts, lectures, appearances by Marcus Garvey and George Washington Carver. Of course, back then they held debutante balls and cotillions and other galas in the ballroom. Here we have Booker T. Washington High School, which was opened in 1921. And it opened with a capacity of 600 students. And with that being the only school for African Americans in Dallas, students came far away in the Dallas area. Students came far away as McKinney, Cleburne, and Denton. African Americans came from that far just to go to school here in Booker T. Washington. Now, as many as 2,000 students attended Booker T. Washington, even though its capacity was for 600 students. This was achieved by dividing the school day up into sections. There was a morning school, an afternoon school, and of course, evening school was provided for those who wanted to get an education. They could get one. Now, this is St. Paul United Methodist Church, and it's actually across the street from Booker T. Washington. We actually stop at Booker T. We actually stop at St. Paul United Methodist Church. So we're just kind of giving you a visual of an actual tour that we do provide. But it is right across the street from Booker T. Washington. The church was founded in 1870. So this church was also designed by William Pittman, the same young man that designed the Pythias building. They moved into this location in 1901, and the completion of the church wasn't until 1927. So they moved in 1901. The completion of the church was not until 1927. But one of the most phenomenal discoveries that we found in researching the church and the history of the church was a part of their, what they call the building fund, okay? I don't know if you guys have a building fund, but in African-American churches, you do have a building fund. We do have a building fund. So what they did was, instead of giving money to the building fund, they actually gave bricks to the building fund. They actually gave literally bricks. And this church still holds services today, and it has a diverse congregation, and it is now one of Dallas's historical landmarks. Here is the original Moreland Branch YMCA. Was built in the 1920s. To understand how ambitious African Americans were during this time, you have to understand there were only 2 Black Ys in the country back, one was in Washington, D.C., and one was in New York. In order for the Y to build a branch in Dallas, an African-American branch in Dallas, it required them to raise $50,000. And instead of raising the $50,000, they actually raised $75,000. Now, this branch was more than just a recreational facility. You may see up here the Green Book. As a matter of fact, this is one of the few remaining buildings in Dallas that was listed in the Green Book. If you're familiar with the movie, The Green Book, it talks about the significance of that book and how people used that book when they traveled during the era of segregation. Here at the Moreland Branch, Y is listed in the 1962 edition of the Green Book as a safe haven for African Americans to rest and refresh when they travel in and through Dallas during Jim Crow. We also stop at this building as well. The building still exists. It is an historical landmark, but most importantly now, it is the home of the Dallas Black Dance Theater. Here is some political activism. This is A. Maceo Smith, the larger picture. The smaller picture is Maynard Jackson. I'm going to tell you a little story about this. They were co-owners of the Dallas Progressive Voter League. And of course, you recognize Maynard Jackson's name because of his son was mayor of Atlanta. But did you know that his senior, Jackson Senior, was a minister and activist here in Dallas, and they lived here. And Mr. Jackson Senior was ran out of Dallas because he had the audacity to run for the Dallas School Board, and because of his ambition, the Jackson family left Dallas and they moved to Atlanta, and the rest is history. This lady here, Juanita Craft, was very, very significant in desegregating Dallas. She was very, very significant. She started NAACP. She did a lot of activism in integrating the Majestic Theater and also the State Fair of Texas. This talks about the continuing migration between from the State Thomas area to Bonton. So we migrated from the State Thomas area to Bonton. We also finally got another African-American school to eliminate some of the overcrowding of Booker T. Washington. This was called Lincoln High School. It was established in 1939. And last but not least, we also got another high school called Madison High School, but Blacks continued to migrate south and it became a problem. And this was the first time Blacks began to move in on whites in South Dallas. Before this, Blacks was just moving into other Freeman towns. But when it began to move in South Dallas became referred to as Birmingham because whites set off bombs under the porches of Black homeowners. And James Madison High School, Feature Hill, was once Forest Avenue High School, and it was renamed with Blacks attended this school in direct opposition to Brown versus the Board of Education.
We're going to stop here to give you guys an opportunity. We know you wanted to do a Q&A and then break into your breakout sessions. So this is the first of 3 presentations. We'll be doing 2 more in the next couple of weeks. So if you guys want us to come back and touch on any of this stuff that we presented tonight, we certainly can. But we want to give you guys a time to ask questions, and also we don't want to stop you from meeting your appointments for your breakouts.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So we did have 2 questions come up in the Q&A. If anyone wants to add any more questions right now, please do so. The first one was, let's see, there is a small rock church on the northeast corner of Preston and Spring Valley. This is from Robin, by the way, and Robin said she believes that it was a freedman's church. Do you know anything about it?
Yes, actually some friends of ours, or if it's the same church, I think it's, I don't know if it is the same church or not. I know it's one of the churches in the White Rock area. We have some friends that purchased the church, the Wessons, and they are in the process of restoring one of the churches that anchored the Freemanstown, located in the northern Dallas area. I'm not sure if this is the same church or not.
Okay. She also asked, what caused the incident in Titus?
You know, it's not a lot written in the history books about it. It was something that when we were doing research on our tour, we became aware of it for the first time. But if you know, there have been so much in terms of media coverage of Tulsa in the last month or so. But that was not rare. So there are those types of things happen in Sherman, Texas. They happen in Longview. They happen in Conroe. They happen in Houston. So there are probably, you know, maybe not the magnitude of Tulsa, but there were incidents all over the country, and not just in southern states. You know,
Springfield.
those kind of things happen in the home of Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, Chicago, and so forth.
Thank you. The next question is if you, whether
Anything
you.
else?
Sorry, I just had some feedback there. If you can tell us anything about the White Rock Chapel in Addison.
I think that's, you know, that's the church that I think that's the church that our friends, the Wessons, Dr. Wesson and his wife have purchased. Maybe if you could ask the person who's asking the question, if they're familiar with the church and know if it's the same church. But if it is the same church, there's the Wessons are some wonderful people, and they were just spiritually led to purchase that church and restore it into its proper form.
Thank you. If whoever asked that, Anne, I think you asked that. If you have any more information or want to expand your question, please let us know.
The church at Preston and Spring Valley, I believe, was Mount Pisgah Baptist. And then
Mount Pisgah.
Pisgah,
So Mount Pisgah is a
yes.
different church, and it is one of the oldest churches. And we didn't get into it a lot in this presentation, but there were African American freedmen's town all around this area, right? So one of them was a place called Alpha, and Alpha was a separate town, and I think that's where Mount Pisgah was originally located. And I think its origin goes back pretty much to the maybe 1870, maybe even the late 1860s. Mount Pisgah, I think I've read some accounts, maybe the oldest African American church in this area.
To follow up on Anne's question about the White Rock Chapel in Addison, she said there is a historical marker on it that said it was founded by freed slaves.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, the even the Freedmanstown's community, there were there were historic churches. My wife mentioned Reverend Griggs. That church, New Hope, was along with St. Paul AME Church, the one that we showed the photograph of. Both of those churches, they go all the way back to 1870. So we're talking about less than a decade after the enslaved people in the state were freed. And those two churches in particular, New Hope, and it still exists, it's no longer in that area. And as my wife showed, St. Paul is still in its location that it has occupied since 1901. Both of those churches were the center of culture, the center of political activity. And she mentioned Reverend Jackson Maynard Jackson Sr., not Maynard Jackson Jr., who later became the mayor of Dallas.
Mayor of Atlanta.
I'm sorry, the mayor of Atlanta. But his father, Maynard Jackson Sr., in 1941, he actually, through his involvement in political organizations, he actually ran. He was the first African American to ever run for a political office. He ran for a post on the school board of Dallas, and that action actually kind of snowballed into the Jackson family being forced to leave Dallas and relocate to Atlanta. And you guys probably know a lot of the rest of that story.
Thank you. Let's see, one other. There is a cemetery near SMU that has a sign that says a family and their slaves were buried there. By any chance, are you familiar with that? That must mean a white family and their
No,
slaves buried there.
I'm not familiar with that particular cemetery. On our tour, we do cover probably the largest historically Black cemeteries in the Dallas city limits proper, but I'm not familiar with the one close to SMU.
I have a question. When will you be resuming live tours?
That's a great question. We've had so many requests to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the pulse on July 1st. And if we feel good about it, we hope to resume in the August-September timeframe.
Excellent. Well, I am sure many of the participants here will be waiting in line. So, any other questions, friends? Anyone have I have a comment, Don. This is for you from my husband, as a matter of fact. He
Okay.
joined and was surprised to see you because he is a friend of yours. I did not know this connection. My husband is Jacques.
Jock is your husband? Oh my God.
So he's in the list of attendees here, and he is having a great time.
You guys don't know how funny that is, but
It's a small world.
well, I hope he won't get mad at me, but he speaks so highly of you, and I really want to wish you the best as you pursue. I think you're pursuing additional studies in the future.
I am. I leave for seminary in July.
Yeah, he constantly asks the men on our Bible study call to pray for you.
Oh,
He's so proud of you.
thank you. Well, he was thrilled to see you here, and he speaks very, very highly of you. So I'm sure he'll be back again next week to hear the next presentation.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm just honored. Wow. Small world.
It is a small world. So friends, listen, I'm going to put in the chat the link to the next Zoom meeting. Give me a minute to log out of this and into that. But before I do, oh, thank you for putting that up there, Dawn. I also want to say the next presentation is about African American influence in Deep Ellum. I'm looking forward to that one.
Mhm.
And then the final presentation will be the real story behind the Juneteenth holiday, which is the week of Juneteenth. So that's perfectly timed. And if anyone has missed it, we in our weekly e-news and on the website and other places, we have advertised that we're taking a trip to the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum the following week. So the 26th, which is a Saturday, 26th of June. If anyone is interested in joining us, you can sign up on the website, transfiguration.net. So let me check one more time to see if I haven't missed any questions. A graveyard in the middle of an apartment complex. And whether you know anything
Yeah,
about
I think that may be the cemetery in I'm not sure if it's still technically Dallas, but it's kind of on that border of Dallas, Carrollton, Richardson area. Yeah, that is actually
We've been to that cemetery.
yeah, I'm
I
very
think
familiar with that
maybe
location.
we need to do a tour of cemeteries too. That sounds really interesting, actually. I don't mean that to be morbid. I think that would, be very interesting. So, well, thank you so much. We can't even express how grateful we are for your time and the effort that went into this presentation. It was really wonderful, and we look forward to the next one. Did you have any questions for us or anything that we can do to make this easier for you next week?
No, the accommodations were great. So no,
excellent.
You guys, great.
Excellent. Well, we will see you next week. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Everyone else, if you want to join us on the other Zoom call, I will start that in just a minute. Thank y'all.